In Challenges for European Welfare States by Borsch Supan, it is said, "In the end, insufficient productive capacities to support the welfare state pose smaller challenges to reform than do time inconsistencies built into the political process of redesigning pension plans." This reveals the fundamental concession among European welfare states, and the state of the Western world as a whole, the impermanence of institution once thought to be universal law. The European welfare state itself is caught between popular pressures and bureaucratic inefficiencies, neither of which bode well for the foreseeable future, the demographic bomb. Populations across the world have been in flux, and Europe, as per the general trend of the developed world, has had a decreasing birth rate below replacement levels. If one sees the attached map, you can see that every nation in the European Union is below the 2.1 recommended fertility rate to maintain economic growth, the average nation hovering at about 1.3 to 1.6 out of the 2.1 that is necessary. This may seem like a worn-out point, but it's necessary to be restated because of its significance. But Europe is going to find itself in a precarious situation in which it will no longer be able to maintain its current standard of living. A number of developed nations have already been seeing an overall decline in living standards. In the UK, for example, 32% of the UK population, 21.4 million people, will be living below a socially acceptable standard of living by the end of 2021, as measured by the minimum income standard. To put it bluntly, the industrial and post-industrial developed world has in a sense caused its own decline in living standards as a direct result of lack of breeding. The periods of growth which seem to be permanent have since stalled and plateaued. The near future of Europe, which is already in a sense the present in Japan, is going to see a massive influx of elderly and aging people who, as a result of their children and grandchildren's reluctance to have kids, will see massive, perhaps even crippling additions to an already overstretched European welfare system. The Japanese present is the European future. That is, a stagnant economy which has not seen any real growth in decades, a working-age population who will increasingly stress themselves into an early grave in search of diminishing scraps of high-paying jobs, and an elderly population who will in all certainty experience a lower quality of care and diminishing pensions as a result of austerity measures. Europe, and by extension the entire developed post-industrial West, is sitting on a demographic time bomb in which there will be no generation who can both satisfactorily care for the elderly and for themselves. Returning to quote the article and projecting the economic prospects for the near future, to quote, "The doubling of old age dependencies then translates to 40% lower benefits for the old and 40% higher contributions for the young," by Borsch Supan. Productivity will shrink, but the demands of the elderly will increase, and perhaps ultimately, this cycle will only continue, with future generations being inherited by an even smaller population. The United States is a generation or two behind this trend, but we too will grind up against the same problem, as our population is less willing or able to have kids from a variety of factors. Presently, the way that Europe and Japan deal with this burgeoning crisis will shape the way that nations further down the road will react. Part 2. Bureaucratic Inefficiency. For many European states, their government realistically only functions to maintain and monitor their welfare apparatus. The government of Denmark, for instance, has realistically not done much in the last 70 years, besides oversee the creation of its social democratic welfare state. The justification of this government's existence, its raison d'etre of these nations, is in of itself the welfare state. That being said, what happens when the governments of these nations have made a critical error in judgment in regard to their handling of their welfare state? The majority of European states have a pay-as-you-go system, in which in simple terms mean that the individual themselves chooses how much money can be subtracted from their paychecks to be put into their retirement fund. However, there is no singular pension policy across all European states. One of the methods which has been proposed which could alleviate this pension time bomb is collecting a fund to be dispersed later. Unfortunately, however, the time in which it would take to build a lasting pension fund for the increasing mass of senior citizens is far too small. To quote, "Time and history is of the essence in pension reform. The baby boom/baby bust transition dictates the time schedule. It makes reform impossible, which was feasible 25 years ago. Or, to put it more bluntly, it is simply too late to have a moderate solution to this problem." The time European nations could have outright negated the ensuing senior citizen surge was 25 or 30 years ago. Western democracies are hardly able to plan ahead one election cycle, let alone multiple generations into the future. What can be done? Realistically, unless European governments take drastic actions in an attempt to put the pin back in the grenade, there is no solution. A number of European nations have already begun enacting austerity measures, which while not avoiding the population bomb, will decrease its payload. To quote, "Denmark, Germany, France, and the UK have enacted measures to increase its statutory normal retirement age. Denmark and Germany from 65 to 67, the UK from 65 to 68, and France from 60 to 62. Most increases will be implemented slowly and gradually, to quote Borch-Suppan. Is not increasing the minimum age of retirement in a sense an admission of defeat, an admission that the current system is no longer able to guarantee a retirement for its citizens, and will require them to work longer into their twilight years? Does it not breed discontent towards the government, and/or status quo society? To see with one's own eyes the slow dissolution of living standards in one's own nation. These are not wanton rhetorical questions. These will be, or are currently, the conversations that European nations refuse to entertain. While this is a radical problem, there are a number of radical solutions that could solve it. However, the very structure of the European Union and its member states as a whole discourages any political action which is remotely radical. The very structure of power of these nations discourages decisive action. As of yet, there is no unified European pension plan or pension fund. To alleviate the damages that the senior citizen time bomb will incur, would require nations to drastically reform the pension systems of 27 nations in the European Union, as well as a dozen or so non-member states. In regard to the previously mentioned minimum increases in retirement age, to quote, "A case in point is France, where the timid increase in retirement age from 60 to 62 was partially reverted after the most recent presidential elections." Borch-Suppan. Even in nations where small austerity measures towards retirement are introduced, there is an immense backlash. To decrease the living standards of the elderly is, to quote, "touching the third rail, with severe consequences for electoral outcomes." What is to be done then when the political class and the citizenry are both avoidant on even attempting to amend this glaring issue? The citizenry obviously doesn't want to lose benefits from the system that they paid their entire life into, while the political class doesn't want to make themselves public enemy number one for suggesting austerity. This is a case where the very nature of the system is the problem. The perverse incentives of maintaining a democratic state are at odds with the future well-being of the nation's people. Referring back to the raison d'etre of European governments, in a manner similar to an author writing a story into a corner, so too have European nations written themselves into a corner existentially. By the very insistence and pride in having a developed, robust welfare state, the welfare state in the mind of its citizens has become sacrosanct. Not even the staunchest high Tory would dare suggest abolishing the NHS. There has been by and large virtually no national or civilizational accomplishments of Europeans to speak of, besides the construction of welfare states and international organizations since the end of the Second World War. What happens when these accomplishments are revealed to be hollow as a result of mismanaged decisions decades in the making? What happens when there is literally nothing left? Conclusion. In the worst case scenario, future generations will be poorer and have greater burdens placed on them by an increasingly bloated government system. The elderly will have reduced quality of pension services, and perhaps in a number of places the pension system may break down altogether. The system as it exists is entirely unequipped to deal with this problem, and the time in which it could have dealt with this problem was 30 years ago. Well-paying jobs will become increasingly scarce, and the entire Western world as a result will have to accept the decreased standard of living across the board. Unless immediate drastic action is taken to alleviate this problem, it will only get worse. But any and all action which may remotely help the problem is ferociously countermanded. European nations have become so accustomed to generalized social services that the mere thought of them no longer functioning as intended is blasphemous. In a sense, Europe itself has been in retirement, and this retirement is going to end abruptly if they do not find a solution. The European presupposition of a robust welfare state is going to be smashed once the dire reality of the situation reaches them, and frankly, they will only have themselves to blame.